My name is Paul Thagard. I'm at the University of Waterloo in Canada, and I work in many fields connected with philosophy, psychology, and artificial intelligence. For a long time, I've been concerned with building computer models of how people think, how they solve problems, how they're creative, how they use analogies, and how they learn. The last books I published were actually a group of 3 that together are a treatise on mind and society that provide a comprehensive idea about what mental mechanisms and neural mechanisms and social mechanisms operate when people are being all the things that we do when we're smart.
Claim that decisions about artificial intelligence nowadays should be based on human needs and not on greedy. So do you want to tell us more about that?
Well, there's been fabulous progress in artificial intelligence over the last decade. And so you see wonderful things happening like self-driving cars and IBM Watson and game-playing programs that are amazingly good. But lots of people are worried that these new technologies could be used for harm rather than for good. So the question is, what's the best ethical principle to apply there? There are a number of principles that you could try to do, but I like the very simple slogan, need not greed. Because lots of what happens in the commercial world or in the political world is not in the service of human needs in general. It's because there's either financial greed or political greed for power. So you want AI to be used for human good. By needs, I mean things like biological needs that all humans have for food and water and so on, but also psychological needs, our needs for love, work, and play. And these are things that AI can actually help with. On the other hand, there are a lot of ways in which artificial intelligence could be used for greed, not just making monies for companies, but also that governments can use to increase social control. For example, reducing people's autonomy by having very severe kinds of surveillance, or ways in which people can be controlled by virtue of artificial intelligence. So when I say that AI should be used for need, not greed, that's what I have in mind.
So in that sense, do you think that artificial intelligence research should be funded by public funds, or do you think the fact that most of actual artificial intelligence research is being produced by private companies is a problem? Do you think it's a problem, or do you think...
Well, it depends on what the aims of those companies are. So right now, I mean, traditionally AI has been funded by governments. It was traditionally funded by DARPA, the American Pentagon, and various government agencies. But over the last decade, it's become so commercially successful that Google and Facebook and companies like that are putting a lot of money into it. Some of that has produced wonderful things. Google Translate, for example, is a tool that's used all around the world. On the other hand, there are potential uses that are really quite dangerous if in fact they're restricting people's autonomy or restricting the ways in which people can interact with each other. So I think it's okay to have the private funding as long as the different agencies, the different companies are behaving ethically. It's very interesting that a lot of those companies have now established their own principles of ethics. Google has a set of principles, Microsoft has a set of principles, and a bunch of others. So I think that's a very good sign that there are people in these companies who want to do good with their new technology. On the other hand, there are other companies building killer robots that can't have very good results for humans. So it's a mix. So I think that the economy can work with private companies as long as they're trying to adhere to the kinds of ethical principles that are in the service of needs.
Do you think transparency should be more relevant in artificial intelligence research nowadays?
Well, in a number of ways. There's wonderful technology called deep learning, where you can train up a neural network on huge databases, and often it can make really, really good decisions. The problem is it's hard to figure out how it made that decision because its knowledge is buried in the connections among millions of neurons. So that's one kind of transparency to worry about. Other kinds have to do with the ways in which the technology can be hidden, for example, when it's used by countries like China as a way of surveilling its population. So it would really be good to know what different companies and what different governments are doing in keeping track of people using artificial intelligence technology.
So do you think governments should have a bigger role in the AI research, in the meaning that they should have more power regarding supervision of all this private research?
Yeah, well, they have a couple of major roles. Governments have always been one of the major supporters of AI research, and I hope that will continue. But also they have this ethical responsibility now to keep track of the kinds of good and bad work that's done with AI. That's particularly clear in the military. In the case of countries like the United States, they're putting a lot of money into building robots that can be part of their armies. And that raises really difficult ethical questions of whether a robot acting autonomously should be allowed to make decisions such as killing people. That, I think, is just really concerning. Fortunately, there's a large number of people in the AI industry who've passed very strong position against having killer robots, and I would really support that. But for that to be effective, it has to be have an impact on the groups of people who are actually building armies, and that's a government role.
But the idea of killer robots, it's based on a thesis or an assumption that it will make war more fair, let's say, more just. And the idea is basically that because robots are not human, they will be more efficient, and they will not make so many mistakes regarding basically deciding who to kill and who not to kill. So do you think this is a good point, or do you think we have good reasons to ban?
Well, it's certainly true that humans do a lot of killing in war that's unjust. They get angry or they get afraid and they kill innocent people. And you might suppose that the robot would be more immune from that. But there are other things that robots just don't have. Like a big part of human ethical judgment isn't just some absolute principle, it's empathy, actually caring about or having a feeling about it. And so from a military point of view, maybe you don't want to have soldiers with empathy, but from an ethical point of view, that's very good, so that a soldier in a complex situation can have empathy for potential victims, and I think that should go into the kinds of thinking they make about who they're going to shoot. So given that there's no prospect of making robots with any kind of empathy or caring or ethical feeling, it's really important to think that they're not going to be superior ethically to what a human in that situation might be.
The big problem in machine ethics or in ethics of artificial intelligence in general is that we have a normative gap, meaning that basically moral philosophers, they don't agree with which kind of ethical principles we should go for. So do you think this normative gap is an obstacle for an ethics of AI, or do you think we can solve this problem?
Well, it's certainly a big problem because philosophers have argued for centuries about what the best ethical theory is. I think that the need principle is a good one, care about human needs. But there's already work going on in AI where people are concerned about what principles you should be following, and all these different companies like Google are putting out their own set of principles. What hasn't been done yet, since these principles have only been developed in the last couple of years, is a close examination to see how much do they agree, how much did, how much do they disagree, and how much do they make sense? So I'm actually planning to do this as a project over the next few months, to go through these 10 different sets of principles and try to figure out how, whether they're, if they all agree, then it's easy. You think, oh, there are a common set of principles that we can digest and put them all together, and that would be really great. I suspect there's going to be some conflicts, and I think they probably are going to reduce down to a much smaller set of principles that are used in fields like medical ethics. Mm-hmm. The 4 principles usually used in medical ethics are justice, autonomy, beneficence, that is doing good, and non-maleficence, that is don't do harm. I'm guessing that the 100 or so different principles that people in AI have been talking about will fall under those. So there needs to be some serious examination of the principles, and it may turn out there's actually quite a lot of agreement there among the different companies and the different governmental agencies that are currently trying to present views of ethics. I'm hoping there'll be lots of agreement. If that's true, then you can look at the productive overlap and use that as a guide that everyone can adopt in trying to figure out how to use AI in society.
What kind of moral values do you think we should implement in artificial intelligence? Do you have a specific value that you think should have more power over others?
Well, it's always hard to put them in an order because often they have to be balanced out in different circumstances. But I think the way that we can get an objective view of value, one that is really tied into the nature of human beings and human biology, is to look at needs. So we all have the same needs for oxygen, for food, for water, for shelter when it's cold. And so those are objective needs. When people don't meet those needs, they suffer harm. And so that can go across the board. And so if you're going to have a robot that's capable of killing people, then it's taking away its life. And so that's a really clear case. The needs that are harder to identify are the ones that are based on psychology. But there's lots of evidence from psychology that people have needs for autonomy, which is a need for freedom. And AI is a big threat to that value because of the surveillance aspects. But there are also, humans have a need for relatedness. That is, they have a need to belong to groups and get along with other people. And so AI needs to be used in a way that's going to foster human relationships rather than challenge it by making people suspicious for each other. The other really important human need is one for competence, which means being able to achieve things, to accomplish things. This is where the work aspects of AI is particularly threatening, because if a lot of productive, satisfying human jobs are taken over by artificial intelligence systems, then individuals lose the capacity to satisfy this need for competence.
Do you think we have a risk of technological unemployment? And if you think so, do you think there is a solution for this problem?
Well, there's clearly major threats. If you look at self-driving cars, for example, what's going to happen to taxi drivers and Uber drivers and truck drivers? That's millions of people. So if those jobs all go away because it's all automated, then that's a lot of jobs that have been lost. And there are lots of other fields where jobs could be threatened as well. Sometimes, though, automation opens up the possibility of other jobs. And some people say, well, maybe it won't be so bad. But if you just look at the driving professions, there's certainly going to be millions of jobs lost.
So do you think the traditional view of work should be also replaced? Maybe we will reach a phase of humanity where work should be replaced by something else?
Well, lots of people have had that fantasy, from Karl Marx to John Maynard Keynes. The thought was that in a modern society, people won't have to work very much because there'd be lots of robots to do things. Well, that might be good if people would have more time for productive activities, such as art and music and other things that can satisfy the need for competence. But there's also a risk that as the technology improves, you'll get more and more inequality. Just as the trend has been in that direction for the last 20 years. So the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and then people who are down at the bottom aren't having opportunities to do things like art and music because they're living in tents on the sidewalk, as is already true with a lot of people in big cities. So if AI was used to increase the overall level of prosperity so that more people would have more time to do things that they see as value, that would be great. But on the other hand, there's a risk that AI will simply be used to increase inequality, and so there'll be more people living in a more marginal existence, and so the amount of need satisfaction will go down rather than up. A lot of this depends on the actions of government and also of companies.
So you think this problem is more about political decision than actually decisions about AI in general?
Well, it's both, because there are questions about what technology can be produced and what technology will be produced, and these are being made at the level of governments. That's the political side of it, but they're also being made at the level of particular companies. Fortunately, some of the companies at least profess to have a big concern about ethics and the social applications of what they're doing. And if they act in responsible ways, that would help a lot without having them directly regulated by the governments. But it's certainly a huge political issue if you're dealing with questions like employment and housing and the degree of happiness and need satisfaction of the people. That's something that every government should be concerned with as well.
Do you think an empirical approach to all these issues regarding the ethics of artificial intelligence is sufficient, or do you think we need also some moral philosophy behind?
Oh, the moral philosophy is absolutely crucial. The empirical side can provide valuable information about how people behave and how their bodies work. But these are really questions of values. We're trying to figure out what ought to happen here. These are questions of ethics. It's not just how things are, it's how things ought to be. And that's really what ethics is concerned about. So you can't dodge ethics here. You're making really important decisions about how people's lives can operate, for good or for bad.
So, and do you think that if we have enough progress in technology, we will reach a time where robots will be conscious as we are, as human beings are?
Well, I don't know of any arguments that that can never happen, but it seems to be a major technological problem. I don't know, for example, whether humans are ever going to land on Mars. It's going to take lots of technology advances that happen. And the same thing for consciousness. We're starting to get a better idea of how consciousness operates in the brain. I've got a neural network theory of consciousness, and there's a couple of others around there that I think are making progress to figure out how the brain achieves consciousness. But that doesn't translate immediately on how you're going to get consciousness into a robot. For one thing, robots don't have the same kind of bodies we do. A lot of our consciousness is tied in on the kinds of inputs we get from our senses and even from the internal parts of our bodies. Robots have senses, but they're very different from ours, and so how it is that a robot is going to have a central capacity to combine those senses and get conscious of them, nobody really knows right now. So nobody knows how to make a conscious robot. I don't say it's impossible, I just say that it's a major technological problem to figure out how you would do that.
Okay. Do you think we need the right theory of mind or consciousness in order to achieve a fully conscious robot, or do you think it can be the other way around? We will create a conscious robot without even knowing everything about the human brain?
Well, some people think that it will just turn out that robots are conscious by accident. It'll be some emergent property. There's a science fiction novel that supposes that the internet will turn out to be conscious entirely on its own as some kind of emergent property. But I don't think that's terribly plausible. Much more likely, I think, is we're going to keep on learning more and more about human brain, figure out what are the mechanisms that produces consciousness in the human brain. We already have some good ideas. One theory says it's a matter of a global broadcast from some brain areas to another. I think that's probably part of it. My own theory of consciousness is that there are particular kinds of neural representations that are formed partly from sensory motor experience, but then compete with each other to see which is going to be the aspect of consciousness. So I'm guessing if you combine some of these ideas, the broadcast idea and the competition idea, then you might get a theory of how consciousness works in the brain, tied in with the kinds of bodies that humans do. Once you've got a good theory like that, then you could start to think about how you might get consciousness in a robot if you want to. Now, I think that's an ethical question right there. Do we actually want robots to become conscious? If they become conscious, then you have to worry about them experiencing pain and suffering. Then you have to start worrying about whether they have rights, whether they have needs themselves. Right now, computers don't have any needs. They're just machines. But if they become conscious, if they're capable of emotions, then they become capable of needs, and we have to have ethical obligations toward them. Frankly, I just assume that society makes a decision not to do that. So even if we can figure out how to make computers conscious, we can simply decide, well, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do the things that would enable a computer to be conscious given what we know about human consciousness. So you should have a bunch of handicaps you put in place. So you simply decide, in the same way you don't build a car that can go 500 kilometers an hour. You could do that, it's technologically feasible, but you don't want a car going that fast down the highway. Similarly, you don't want to build a computer that is so sentient, so conscious, so emotional that it has needs and therefore has rights, and we have moral obligations to them. So that's where I think we need to make really important value decisions about what not to do.
Okay. And do you think the same reasoning can be applied to human beings in general? So do you think we have a problem of having too many humans right now in the planet, and we should think also ethically about that problem?
Well, right now we got about 7.5 billion, and the world seems to be able to handle that. Fortunately, population control seems to be self-limiting, and that if people become prosperous and educated, then they stop having so many children. If it gets over 10 billion, then things are going to be really hard. But I don't think it's a problem with the kinds of population we've got now, as long as the resources are distributed in fair ways. There's enough food and water and oxygen to support the needs of all human beings. So at this level, I don't think that's a big problem.
So do you think robots can be creative as human beings are creative?
Yeah, well, robots already are creative. So there already are robots that can paint, and maybe they're not Picasso, but they paint better than I do. There already are computers that can generate music way better than most people can. There already are computers that can generate creative new moves in games like Go and chess. That's really very impressive. So that's creativity already exists. Is there creativity at the level of humans? Well, no. There's not been a great robot scientist yet. So I think that's something for well off in the future, but it's not out of the question.
Okay, some people argue that emotions, along with consciousness, are two of the biggest caveats regarding achieving a strong artificial intelligence or a fully conscious artificial intelligence. Do you agree with that? What are your thoughts about emotions and artificial intelligence?
Yeah. Well, first, it's important to recognize that emotions are a big part of human intelligence. Sometimes people say, are you emotional or rational? Well, that's a false division, because emotions help a lot. Emotions help us to focus on what's important. They help us to pay attention to what matters. They help us to evaluate different situations. So I think emotions are actually a crucial part of human intelligence. So if you wanted to have human-like intelligence in a robot, they'd have to have emotions. But that's problematic, because a big part of human emotions isn't just our thinking ability, it's what comes from our bodies. What's happening in your heartbeat and your breathing rate and your hormonal levels, these are all contributing. So it's actually incredibly technically difficult to think about how you would have emotions in a robot. But I think that's something they're missing, because emotions aren't something that gets in the way of human intelligence. They're something that really contributes to it. So what you might try to do is get the kinds of evaluation and attention and focus that makes emotions a big part of human intelligence in some other way. That probably would be the better route. Frankly, that's the route I prefer, because if you did manage to give robots emotions, then they're capable of suffering, and then we've got serious moral obligations toward them. I'd rather keep the robots as servants and not have to worry about whether they have rights.
Do you think artificial intelligence will also help us to free ourselves of our biological constraints or limitations, and actually can help us to live longer and maybe to achieve immortality?
I like what Woody Allen said. He said, I don't want immortality through my work, I want immortality through not dying. And so there are people in AI who think that they're not going to ever have to die because they can be uploaded into a computer. So for example, Ray Kurzweil, who's the chief engineer of Google, thinks that it's only a matter of time, maybe a decade, before there'll be enough computer capacity that he can be immortal, because he could have robots explore his brain, figure out all the brain connections, and then live forever. That strikes me as really implausible. For one thing, it's not just a matter of your synaptic connections that enable you to think in certain ways, it's also a matter of how you can feel, how you can have emotions, how you can have pleasure and pain. And that really depends on the body. And I think that the idea that you can simply transform yourself into a computer is neglecting a lot of what it is to be human. So I think the idea of immortality through uploading into a computer is, first of all, technologically very implausible, and secondly, not at all very attractive. So that kind of immortality doesn't appeal to me at all.
And actually, it's quite fun, because those researchers, they come from a scientific background, let's say, but there is a lot of dualistic assumptions in all these mind-uploading scenarios, right? Because there is an eye that will be uploaded in a computer, but this eye is not related with your body or how you interact with your environment. So do you think we have like a categorical mistake here happening?
No, it's not a question of dualism, it's a matter of too simple materialism. It's the idea that all the processing is just going on in the brain, rather than the brain that's constantly interacting with the body. So emotions have a cognitive aspect. So we kind of praise the situation to see how it's going for our goals. But they also have this embodied aspect, the fact that your stomach is churning, you've got 300 million neurons in your stomach that are sending information. And of course, all the hormonal levels, your cortisol levels, and so all these things are going into the emotional part of evaluation. And emotion is a really central part of human thinking in general. It's not just something that gets in the way or something that's an add-on. It's really quite crucial. So none of the kinds of uploading that someone like Kurzweil is talking about seems to be feasible if you want to be anything at all like a human being. And of course, there's other technological problems as well. So I don't think it's very likely, and I don't think it's very attractive. So I don't really worry too much about the immortality question.
What do you think is the biggest existential risk regarding technology?
Well, the existential risk that a lot of people are worried about is that computers are soon going to be so smart that they'll dominate us, that they'll be able to take over the world. We'll have, some people call it the robot apocalypse with robots. And there's been so many movies that show that, things like the Terminator movies or the Matrix movies. And lots of people like Bill Gates and Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking are extrapolating from current progress in AI to thinking that that's really quite close. I don't think it's true. I've done a fairly careful analysis of what's involved in human intelligence and what's involved in the best programs in current AI. And it seems to me from that this all-powerful human-level AI is actually a long way off. Some people would say 100 years rather than the 10 years that other people are predicting. So I think in the short term, that is in the next 100 years, AI isn't nearly as big an existential risk as other risks that humans have from things like nuclear war, climate change, epidemics. Those all seem to be more serious existential risks than we have from artificial intelligence. 100 years from now, it might be different.